Welcome to this tutorial on the neural control of facial expressions. I've got two learning objectives for you in this tutorial. I want you to be able to discuss the control of facial expression by upper motor neurons in the cerebral cortex. And then I want you to use that knowledge to predict patterns of facial weakness that might follow lesions of the cerebral cortex, the internal capsule, or the facial nerve itself. So, in order to begin this tutorial, I want to introduce a relatively common clinical phenomenon, and that is that a lesion involving the distribution of the middle cerebral artery, such as a stroke or a hemorrhage, often results in contralateral facial weakness. But that weakness is typically limited to just the lower part of the face. So the question is, why is this weakness restricted in this way to just the lower part of the facial muscles? And in order to explain this phenomenon, we need to learn something about how the muscles of facial expression are governed by different neurons in the cerebral cortex. So before we get there, let's just remind ourselves of some of the more peripheral components of this system. So let's consider a couple of study questions. First of all, what cranial nerve innervates the muscles of facial expression? So think for just a moment and record your responses. Secondly, where would you find the relevant motor nucleus? Now, if you checked your references, or hopefully you knew from your studies earlier that the facial motor nucleus is what's responsible for supplying muscles of facial expression via cranial nerve 7, then you got the answer to the first one. But now what I want you to reinforce is, where in the brain would you find that facial motor nucleus? Is it in the thalamus, the midbrain, the pons, or the medulla oblongata? Now that we know that the facial motor nucleus is found in the pons, let's actually go find it in our digital atlas of the brainstem in Sylvius 4. So I've just opened our launcher window in Sylvius 4, and I will select from Brainstem Cross-Sectional Atlas all structures. And this will open up a collection of sections that are fully segmented and annotated that will allow us to find the facial motor nucleus. So now that you know where to look, it shouldn't be too difficult to actually find it. So first, let's select a section through the pons. And I can do that simply by pulling down this slider in our navigational window to the left to about the region of the middle of the pons. And so now we have a section that is present, and I'll make it just a little bit larger for us. And as we mouse over structures, we see that these structures light up, as do labels. And I want to draw your attention to this central region of the brainstem. This is what we refer to as the tegmentum. It's the part of the brainstem between the ventricular system up above and the specialized white matter and gray matter structures that we find down below in various divisions of the brainstem. So that tegmentum is the core. That's where we find our cranial nerve nuclei. That's the part of the brainstem that's most like the spinal cord, where we have nuclei for sensation and for motor control. Now the facial nucleus, it's one of those motor nuclei that innervate muscles that have a particular embryological derivation. They come from the pharyngeal arches, and that's significant because this tells us where to look for the nucleus that grew out the axons that supply those muscles. And in this case, we're concerned with the muscles of facial expression, cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve, and the facial motor nucleus. Now these neurons in embryological development migrate to a somewhat lateral and intermediate position in the tegmentum of the brainstem. And for the facial motor nucleus, we find it right here. So now in yellow, we have our facial motor nucleus. Now one might think that these axons would simply take a straight shot out and exit the ventrolateral aspect of the junction between the pons and the medulla. But in fact, the course of these axons reflects this embryological migration of the motor neurons that I just mentioned. So this nucleus migrated from a more dorsal position, and as the neurons moved, they elongated their axons. So the axons from the facial motor nucleus actually wrap around and form this band of nerve root that wraps around the abducens nucleus. So the abducens nucleus makes a bit of a protrusion at the base of the fourth ventricle, and on top of that nucleus are these axons of the facial nerve that form a little bit of a hill on top of that protrusion. So we call this the facial colliculus. If we were looking down at the floor of the ventricle, we'd see these two little humps here, and that reflects the course of the facial nerve. And then from here, the facial nerve projects towards this angle here between the pons, the medulla just below, and then the cerebellum out to the lateral aspect. So there's the facial motor nucleus. This is the structure that is in question in this tutorial. So let's continue on now and talk more about the way that upper motor neurons provide input to this structure. Okay, well, I'm going to introduce the brain to you again using this brain model, and I want to draw your attention to that part of the motor cortex that is involved in governing facial expression. So what we're looking at here is the lateral surface of the right hemisphere, of course, and all of these red lines are meant to illustrate blood vessels that supply the surface of the brain. In fact, these would all be branches of the middle cerebral artery. Now, the motor cortex is found in the banks of the precentral gyrus, which is located right here. Of course, the central sulcus being this space just posterior to that precentral gyrus, which runs all the way from the longitudinal fissure in the dorsal midline to the lateral fissure here between the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes. Now, if you viewed my tutorial where I put my fingers on an actual human brain, you get the idea that the central sulcus is found roughly near the middle of the hemisphere. And as I'm putting my fingers down over the central sulcus now, my middle finger would be representing the precentral gyrus, and my index finger representing the postcentral gyrus, with the space between my fingers representing the central sulcus. So that part of the motor cortex that governs our voluntary control of the facial muscles is found out here where my fingertip is located, in the inferior segment of the lateral precentral gyrus. So about the fingertip region of my middle finger is where we would find this relevant part of the motor cortex. So here we are, the inferior segment of the precentral gyrus. This is governing the movements of the contralateral face. Now, I need to be more specific than that in order to answer this clinical conundrum. What was discovered in recent years is that these upper motor neurons that are otherwise representing the face are actually governing the movements of just the lower part of the contralateral face. So as illustrated in this brain model, this is the region of cortex that, when damaged by that middle cerebral artery infarction, is responsible for the weakness of the contralateral lower face. Now, what about the cortical representation of the upper part of the face? Well, we used to think that it was represented likewise here in the lateral part of the precentral gyrus. We now know from studies done in non-human primates that the control of the upper part of the face seems to be governed by a region along the mid-sagittal surface of the brain. So as I take this brain model apart, show you the medial face of the right hemisphere, I'll draw your attention to a region in the banks of the cingulate sulcus that's found right about here, just in front of our paracentral lobule. So in the banks of the cingulate sulcus is a division of the medial premotor cortex that we call the cingulate motor area. And it's this part of the premotor cortex that governs the movements of the upper part of the face. Now, one explanation to this clinical conundrum is that the upper part of the face is spared simply because the medial face of the hemisphere is not supplied by the middle cerebral artery at all. It's supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. But there's another anatomical fact that also works in favor of preservation of the upper part of the face, and that is that the cingulate motor area found here innervates the facial motor nucleus on both sides of the midline of the pons. So there's bilateral innervation from upper motor neurons here down to the relevant cranial nerve nuclei, the facial motor nucleus in this case. So let's look at a figure from our text from the box found in Chapter 17 of Neuroscience 5th edition, Box A. So this figure provides in schematic form what we've been talking about. So I'll first draw your attention to the representation of the face in this case, the right primary motor cortex. So we find upper motor neurons that send their axons through the white matter of the hemisphere, through the internal capsule between the thalamus and the basal ganglia, into the brainstem, through the cerebropeduncle, and into the pons. And as these axons enter the pons, they cross the midline and synapse preferentially on those lower motor neurons that govern the lower part of the face, as is illustrated here in this middle picture. So this explains the contralateral bias in the governance of these motor neurons that innervate the lower face. Now, I'll draw your attention next to the cingulate motor regions, which are found here along the midline of the hemisphere in the banks of the cingulate sulcus. These neurons project down to the more dorsal columns of motor neurons in the facial motor nucleus that innervate the upper part of the face. And the additional anatomical fact is depicted here in this figure, and that is that the facial neurons that govern the upper face receive bilateral input from the cingulate motor regions in each hemisphere. So this, together with the differential distribution of these upper motor neurons, explains why the upper part of the face is spared with the middle cerebral artery infarction. In fact, it's quite difficult to have a lesion in the brain that produces motor weakness in the upper part of the face because of this bilateral pattern of innervation. So even a unilateral stroke involving the anterior cerebral artery is likely to have spared motor control for the upper face. Now, also shown in this figure, just for completion, is what would happen with lesions that are deeper and more peripheral than a stroke involving the cortex. So notice, for example, the lesion illustrated by this letter B. This would be a stroke involving the white matter of the internal capsule. And such a stroke would affect the input from the precentral gyrus to the contralateral facial motor nucleus, replicating the impact of the stroke that one would see with a middle cerebral artery infarction out here to the cortex. There would be sparing of the upper motor neurons because of the bilateral innervation coming from the cingulate motor area. If one had a lesion to the facial nerve itself, or a pathological process, such as what happens in Bell's palsy, one would expect a distribution of weakness that would cover both the upper and the lower regions of the face. So in clinical practice, during a neurological exam, it's always important to test motor function individually for the lower part of the face and the upper part of the face. And this can be done by asking a patient to show their teeth, to check the lower muscle tone, and to have them raise their eyebrows, often against a little bit of manual resistance, so that the clinician can feel and see the strength of the muscles that are governing the upper part of the face. Now, there's some consequence for this anatomy with respect to how we understand the facial expressions that are so important to us as people. We read so much into the human face. We can interpret intention, we can appreciate emotion as we observe the movement of the facial muscles. And if you're like me, things get a little bit strange when you're sitting in front of a camera as I am now, especially if I'm in a portrait studio getting my picture taken by a photographer. We're often asked to smile in those circumstances, and somehow the smile typically is just not so authentic, is it? At least for myself, I have a terrible time in that circumstance trying to produce what looks like a compelling smile. What ends up is what looks like a fake smile or a contrived smile. And that's because that forced smile is really a product of our primary motor cortex out here in the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is ultimately the motivator of volitional action. So that forced smile, it's really not reflecting genuine emotion often. It's something that we're trying to contrive for the moment. Now, should we express an actual emotion, hopefully it's much more authentic, communicates in a compelling way what's really going on in our internal state. That kind of smile is what we really want to capture in our photographs. That's the smile that's motivated by the cingulate motor area. So if you run across a photograph of an individual in a magazine or perhaps in your own photo album, you can tell very readily whether the smile is the authentic smile reflecting emotion, or whether it's what's sometimes called the pyramidal smile, which arises from force of will from the premotor cortex conveyed along a pathway parallel to the pyramidal fibers that ultimately control the movements that are expressed via our spinal cord. So next time you see a person's face, think about these differential regions of the lateral precentral gyrus and the more medial cingulate motor area as they govern the integrated expression of emotion and other behaviors that we express with our face. Now, there are some important consequences for understanding the way these upper motor neurons govern the facial motor nucleus. There are folks that have strokes involving various pathways in the brain, of course, and some of them are known to affect either the voluntary expression of movement involving the face or the emotional expression of movement involving the face. So this schematic figure just illustrates what we've been talking about. There are parallel pathways coming from motor control centers in the brain that converge upon the facial motor nucleus and its neurons that ultimately activate the muscles of facial expression. We've described those neurons in the precentral gyrus that are associated with voluntary control over the facial motor nucleus. And if one should have a stroke involving those upper motor neurons or the pathway by which those neurons innervate the contralateral pons, one can have a condition known as voluntary facial paresis, in which there is weakness when you ask a patient to execute a voluntary movement involving the perioral muscles, such as showing their teeth. They may only do so on one side of the face. But if you can get that person to smile with the authentic smile of emotion, you may find a much more symmetrical response. And that's because the neural systems associated with the cingulate motor areas and their bilateral projections to the pons remain intact. Now, a much more rare condition can be found for individuals that have some damage, often requiring some bilateral injury to the cingulate motor area or their pathways that connect that part of the brain down to the pons. So damage to those pathways would produce the complementary deficit, something that we call emotional facial paresis. These would be an individual that, when told an amusing story, might only express emotion on one side of the face. However, if you ask those people to raise their eyebrows or show their teeth, they might do so symmetrically, because the pyramidal pathways from the lateral precentral gyrus are intact. Okay, there's one more point to consider before we conclude this tutorial, and that has to do with other cranial motor nuclei that you may be wondering about. So, what are the cranial motor nuclei that have a significant contralateral bias in the way upper motor neurons innervate them? And I'll give you a principle that will help you understand this. Essentially, whatever we can do with our cranial muscles that are lateralized, that implies a contralateral bias in the way upper motor neurons project to the relevant lower motor neurons. So some of us can wink with just one eye or not the other. Some of you are able to raise just one eyebrow. I can't really do that very well. I can only control my frontalis muscle, evidently through some symmetrical input. But if you could only raise one eyebrow, that would suggest that there is a contralateral bias to the innervation of those muscles. Okay, so some of you can raise an eyebrow, most of us can wink one eye or the other. We can often chew just on one side of our mouths, can we not? Imagine biting down on a hard nut. That's a lateralized activity. And finally, we can protrude our tongue just to one side of our mouth or the other. This is often something that's done in assessing the integrity of upper motor neuron pathways to the nucleus that controls the tongue. We might ask a patient to stick their tongue into just one cheek, something like that. And you can often put your hand on the cheek and feel the force of that protrusion. So these are all examples of lateralized motor functions that we can do with cranial muscles. And the relevant nuclei then would be the trigeminal motor nucleus that allows us to chew just on one side of the mouth, the facial motor nucleus, as we've been talking about in this tutorial, and the spinal accessory nucleus. Now this is the nucleus in the upper part of the cervical cord that allows us to shrug our shoulders, which we usually do symmetrically, but of course it is possible to fractionate that movement just to one side of the midline or the other. And then lastly, the hypoglossal nucleus, taking them in numerical order. This is the cranial nerve, nerve 12, that allows us to protrude our tongue. So these four nuclei are the cranial nerve nuclei that likely have a contralateral bias in the way upper motor neurons project down to the relevant lower motor neurons. The other motor nuclei are organized in a much more symmetrical bilateral fashion. For example, we don't cry out of one eye. We don't secrete saliva just from one gland by force of will. So there's coordination across the midline, either at the level of the cortex and or at the level of the brainstem itself. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this discussion of facial expression. We'll have much more to say about facial expressions when we talk about emotions later on in the course. But for now, I hope this has helped you understand the way upper motor neurons in the cerebral cortex govern the lower motor neurons that are found in the brainstem.